Hello everyone, I'm David Vaucher. Welcome to Return on Racing. Return on Racing is powered by Vaucher Analytics, which helps race teams and drivers drive efficiencies off track so they can fuel success on track. Return on Racing is also brought to you by the Motorsports Sponsorship Accelerator, the most cutting-edge resource out there for learning how to find, grow, and maintain long-term sponsorship relationships. Now that seems like an especially appropriate segue given the topic of today's show. There are so many resources out there talking about sponsorship, and really you see the effects of sponsorship in all of racing. Now, as I said, there are plenty of organizations and people that will sell you ways of sourcing those sponsorships, and I am guilty as charged. I am, however, very proud of the package I've put together, and I would love for you to go check it out on the front page of the Vaucher Analytics website. However, one area that does not get talked about so much, and this really is crucial to sponsorship, and it's not talked about enough, and I'd like to think that I am somewhat unique in bringing this up so much, and that is the other side of the sponsorship coin. Because when we talk about sponsorship, it's a business. And if there are revenues in a business, there are also costs. And these costs can erode all of the effort that you're putting in to finding sponsorship to help fulfill your race dreams or those of the team in which you are a member of. So let's talk about the hidden costs of sponsorship in not just any series, but the most expensive and prestigious in the world, and that is F1. Specifically, today on Return on Racing, I want to cover how delivery strain threatens performance and profitability. Let's get started. Now, sponsorship is the lifeblood of Formula One, and really it's the lifeblood of all motorsports, going back to when people decided they should put multiple motor vehicles on a track and see who could go the fastest. Now, every team on the F1 grid depends on commercial partners to fund their relentless pursuit of speed, from car development to logistics to world-class talent acquisition. But beneath the surface of glossy car liveries and global brand activations lies a challenge few outside the paddock discuss: the hidden escalating costs of delivering sponsorship obligations. It's a reality that should motivate teams to think about partnership strategy, portfolio design, and long-term profitability. And in this episode of Return on Racing, I want to break down the true, often underestimated costs of sponsorship in F1, why margins don't scale linearly with revenue, and how teams can optimize their sponsorship portfolio for both profit and performance. If you're part of an F1 team, sponsor organization, or operate in motorsport management, understanding this hidden dynamic is critical to protecting both your commercial success and competitive edge. As I said, sponsorship goes all the way back to the beginnings of motorsports, but you could argue that it's nowhere more apparent than in F1 because the money is everywhere. Sponsorship in Formula One is more than financial support. It's woven into the sport's DNA. Brands invest millions, sometimes tens of millions, for returns such as global visibility on cars, driver suits, and team apparel, high-end hospitality at iconic races like Monaco, Las Vegas, or Silverstone, co-branded content and digital campaigns, access to drivers, team principals, and engineers for media, events, and product showcases. Technical collaborations and product integration opportunities is also one potential return, but ultimately the list is almost limitless, limited only by the creativity of the sponsorship team. So what's the result, or at least the intended result? Well, it's growing brand value for sponsors and essential revenue for teams striving to stay competitive, and arguably, or almost inarguably, it's pretty apparent just how much this is the case, but inarguably the most technologically advanced, resource-intensive sport on the planet. But here's what doesn't get discussed enough: the operational and performance trade-offs that come with fulfilling these sponsorship commitments. So let's now talk about the cost aspect of this equation. Let's talk about the total costs of sponsorship, and it's more than just money. While most teams track headline sponsorship revenue meticulously, when was the last time you heard about costs to deliver? Anywhere. This could include items such as the operational costs of global activations in a world where input costs keep escalating. I've talked about this in several previous episodes of Return on Racing. There's also the human capital strain on drivers, engineers, and support staff. You should also consider the logistics burden of appearances, events, and hospitality programs. Also, there's the performance impact to consider, particularly when driver fatigue or staff burnout creeps in. Also, we could look at the opportunity cost when team resources are diverted from racing or technical tasks to commercial obligations. In other words, the true cost of sponsorship includes both financial and non financial factors, all of which erode the profitability or margin of each partnership. It's important to note, though, that even though some of these costs seem indirect, they can still be tied back in some way to an actual currency loss. So it's important to have an understanding of these because this is where your margin creep and your margin erosion happens silently. Because this is the thing, inefficient sponsorship management is not just about cost escalation, it's compounding. Hidden costs in sponsorship delivery don't just erode margins, they create a compounding financial trap for F1 teams. And here's how it might play out. Imagine a $50 million title or principal sponsorship. Poorly controlled activations, inflated logistics, or unmanaged resource drain quietly strip away 5% of the deal's value. That's $2.5 million in lost contribution margin over what you could reasonably be expected to spend to delight your client. Because, of course, for any of these sponsorship deals, there will be a cost to deliver. So, what I'm referring to here is an additional $2.5 million over what should have been spent to satisfy the client. So, with that in mind, to plug that gap, what do teams have to do? Well, they have to chase more sponsorship revenue. But here's the problem. Every new sponsor introduces its own obligations, more events, more appearances, more travel, and more content production. More partners implies almost definitely more complexity, more operational overhead, and more strain on personnel performance. And these costs compress margins again, repeating the cycle. So it's now apparent why sponsorship cost control isn't just about one account. The hidden cost isn't isolated, it ripples through the entire commercial model, forcing teams to run faster just to stand still. Leaving margin on the table due to inefficient sponsorship management isn't just a lost opportunity, it directly increases your future revenue targets and operational burden. In other words, every dollar of avoidable delivery costs today implies higher sponsorship sales pressure tomorrow, and more sponsors do not necessarily lead to more profit if each new deal introduces unstructured strain. So let's now take a look at some quantitative benchmarks for various classes of sponsorship. And I want to do that by introducing the sponsorship margin equation, which, if you're familiar with general business terms, you'll recognize as just the business margin equation. Because, to repeat myself from earlier, sponsorship is a business. So the equation is as follows. Total margin in percentage terms is 1 minus the full delivery costs over sponsorship revenue, where full delivery costs account for things such as direct expenses, personnel time, operational complexity, performance trade-offs, and long-term reputational risks from overcommitment or underdelivery. A little more on that one later. Understanding this full cost picture is the first step to building a sponsorship portfolio that maximizes profit and protects performance. And with that last sentence, you might start to see an image forming in your mind of a balance, because there is a balance to strike in motorsport sponsorship. Now, sponsorship is a client relationship business. In such a service line where we're not talking so much about the production of goods, but rather the delivery of a service, margins have the potential to be very high. However, there is an important balance to maintain. If your margins are in fact very high, which I'll just define here as over 80%, this might mean that you are not servicing your client, that's to say your sponsor, adequately enough, and they are at risk of leaving you in the future. If your margins are very low, let's go ahead and call that less than 30%, this might mean that your delivery costs are going unchecked. Now, if that relatively low margin still translates to a large dollar amount because you are dealing with a high value, high touch sponsor, this could be workable, but just maintain the hypothesis in mind that some cost reduction could still be achievable and should be pursued. You should always be looking to optimize your delivery costs while always maintaining the focus on client delight. Here's the element that gets a little bit tricky, and that's the nonlinear margin curve. It's tempting to assume that larger sponsorship deals automatically assume higher yield margins. But in F1, unless mitigation measures are taken, the relationship between deal size and profitability follows, if not a diminishing returns curve, at least a bell curve. more information here in just a moment. So let's first talk about small fragmented deals. Now, these can appear high margin, but they often carry hidden inefficiencies such as localized activations, one-off events, and overhead that erode profit. These are absolutely the ones, because they are small, that should deliver high margins, not necessarily high currency amounts, but high margins. Mid-tier strategically designed deals can hit the sweet spot and often do due to scalable activations, manageable demands, and healthy margins relative to revenue. Where it gets interesting are the mega deals. So these are title, principal, or technical partnerships. These deliver high absolute profit, but compressed percentage margins due to escalating delivery obligations and operational strain. What's the goal? Well, portfolio balance, but that is to say, optimizing the mix of deal types to maximize both top line revenue and sustainable margins, delivering the revenues needed to keep operations going. Because remember, in the end, bills are paid in dollars or euros, not margin percentage points. So we're really talking about two different types of balance here. One is balancing your need for revenue to keep racing, or an F1 team's need for revenue to keep racing, and the imperative that they continue to delight their sponsors so that relationship can grow over time. The second balance is within your own sponsorship portfolio, within the sponsorship portfolio of an F1 team, to have a balance between some of these lower margin sponsors and higher margin sponsors. In the source article for this episode of Return on Racing, I've got a more detailed table with information on various sponsorship categories and the margin range that you would typically see in some of these. Now, for the purposes of recording, I'm not going to read through all of this table. I will, however, post a link to that article in the show notes. And again, for the purposes of recording, I just want to touch on some of the key takeaways. Regional sponsors often appear lucrative, but fragmented activations and travel can dilute margins. The lower down the sponsor tiers you go, the more imperative it becomes to have a common mechanism in place so as to standardize, distribute, and ultimately minimize the delivery costs of those sponsorship tiers. High value sponsors increase total profit, or at least they should, but they carry more operational strain, compressing margins and less tightly managed. And this can spiral really quickly if you're not managing things like travel or time spent with your operational teams, technical teams. I mean, pick your team, but costs can spiral if it is a very high touch sponsor. It's also important to remember that these high value sponsors can require long and expensive sales cycles to close. So let's imagine that you've spent 18 months or 2 years closing a very high value sponsor. That should be baked in to the cost of your sponsorship, because if you're not accounting for it, that is a large cost that is not being tracked, and therefore you're going to get to the end of your sponsorship cycle and say, well, where'd the money go? Well, it just wasn't accounted for on the upfront pre-sponsorship cost. So this is not sponsorship delivery. This is pre-sponsorship. You haven't even closed it, but it still needs to be tracked. So for F1 teams, the margin conversation isn't just financial, and we have touched on that. So excessive driver commitments, engineering resource diversion, operational complexity, all of these. And unmanaged, these hidden costs can erode the very results that attract sponsors in the first place, which can then become a vicious cycle for teams chasing revenue without strategic delivery discipline. So the cycle, again, you're not accounting for costs, which leads to lower contribution margin than you'd otherwise want. You have to then chase more sponsors to plug those gaps. Over time, you're putting more and more stress on your organization. You're delighting your sponsors less and less, and you have a vicious spiral downwards where you're really spinning your wheels very fast, but you're not getting anywhere. So how is it the top teams optimize for high margin, low strain sponsorship? The most successful organizations approach sponsorship portfolio management with the same precision as race strategy. I've got 5 elements I want to talk about here briefly. The first is total cost transparency. So this means mapping every sponsor obligation across the calendar and quantifying both financial and resource costs, including staff time, logistics, and performance trade-offs. And it is really important to be exhaustive. And the more you can actually talk to your staff and find out how much they're working on some of these sponsorship obligations, the more information that the overall organization will have to map what that total cost transparency looks like. Second is strategic segmentation, so grouping sponsors by revenue, delivery burden, and strategic value, and identifying those low margin, high strain deals for renegotiation or phase out. I would not be surprised if in doing this exercise you see a manifestation of something I see often, if not all the time, in problem solving. That's the 80/20 rule, where you have basically 80% of your revenue coming from 20% of the sponsors, and everything else is a long tail. Now, that does not mean that you have to ditch a percentage of your sponsors, but it does mean that you have to accept that some will deliver more than others, some less, and adjust accordingly. Number three is scalable activation design. This implies consolidating events around key races or geographies, prioritizing digital content to reduce travel and physical appearance strain, and creating modular activation assets that serve multiple sponsors efficiently. If this sounds like you're going to shortchange some people, potentially it could be that way. It is all about setting expectations up front so that sponsors clearly know what they're getting. So, a $10,000 sponsor, to illustrate, should be treated well, but should they get the same in person high touch treatment as the $1 million sponsor? No. So, it's up to the organization to set those expectations up front and deliver accordingly. Number four would be performance protection policies. And this would include things such as limiting driver commitments, especially during critical race windows, and building buffer periods in the calendar to preserve staff recovery and engineering focus. And finally, contractual guardrails are also very important. So you want to set clear boundaries on sponsor obligations from day one, embed flexibility for digital or scalable activation options, and regularly review partner demands to prevent scope creep. This is so important. You absolutely have to have conditions mapped out in a contract and stick to them. Yes, it is very important to deliver and delight the client, but if you're over delivering to the point where it's straining your organization beyond what you originally planned for, that is just not sustainable. So that's really what we've talked about. It's sustainability. It's going beyond revenue, looking at the other side of the coin and making the business case for margin discipline. Optimizing for sponsorship margin isn't just about protecting the bottom line, as these efforts directly support on-track competitiveness by reducing operational distractions. They support long-term sponsor satisfaction through reliable, high-quality delivery. Team sustainability is also supported by minimizing burnout and maximizing resource efficiency. And reputation management, we've already talked about this, but it has to be repeated. This ensures the team is seen as both commercially savvy and performance first, which puts you in a better position to source those sponsorships more easily going down the line. So if you're seen as a team that does business well and performs well and has those core values really embedded into the organizational way of operating, ideally sponsors or sponsor candidates will come to you in the future. This is not just about protecting yourself, it's about building a foundation to make yourself even more successful down the line. In short, disciplined sponsorship management allows F1 teams to balance the demands of partners, fans, and performance. Truly a recipe for sustained success both on and off the track. So in conclusion, should be obvious at this point, but sustainable sponsorship is a competitive advantage. In the fast-paced world of Formula One, commercial growth and racing excellence aren't mutually exclusive, but only if teams proactively manage the hidden cost curve of sponsorship. And in fact, nowadays, commercial growth and racing excellence are absolutely tied. In the earlier days of Formula One, bit different. But today, if you want to do well on track, the commercial growth has to be there. So by designing a high margin, low strain sponsorship portfolio, teams can maximize revenue without sacrificing performance. They can optimize resource use across commercial and technical operations. They can protect driver and staff well-being throughout a demanding global calendar, and they can deliver exceptional value to sponsors while safeguarding the core mission, which is delighting them to ultimately win races. And on that positive note, I want to thank you as always for choosing to spend your time with me on this episode of Return on Racing. If you like this episode and you want more insights like this, I would ask that you please consider subscribing to the Return on Racing newsletter. This is the weekly newsletter from Voce Analytics covering actionable motorsport strategy, cost breakdowns, and sponsor intel, all in less than 500 words. So the idea is to give you quick, actionable insights that you can apply to your operations right away. If this is something you're interested in signing up for, you can either do so in the article, which again I will link to in the show notes, or from the front page of the Vaucher Analytics website. That is vaucheranalytics.com. Thank you so much again for spending your time with me here, and I look forward to speaking with you again on the next episode of Return on Racing.